far away. Anyway, like Natalie said, my name is Tyler. I work at MOCSA, the Metropolitan Organization to Counter Sexual Assault. I recognize a couple of faces. Hi, Sarah, good to see you. But I assume that everyone is familiar with MOCSA. If you're not, that's totally fine. I'm going to give a little bit of a brief overview of some of the services that we offer here in a moment. But before we get started, I did want to just make note that we are talking about sexual violence today. We are talking about sexual assault, specifically trauma. So it would not be very trauma informed of me in this trauma informed training if I did not give a trigger warning at the beginning. By no means are we going to be showing any graphic videos or images or anything like that. And particularly, it's going to be just conversations about like the culture around sexual violence. But that being said, it is sexual violence. And so if that is a trigger for anyone or anything like that, by all means, you are welcome to do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. Most of you have cameras off, that's totally fine. If you need to turn your camera off, that's also totally fine. But I definitely want to make sure that everyone understands that I don't know you and your experiences, and you don't know me and my experiences, and so I want to respect that. So if there is ever a time where I say something or do something that you feel is inappropriate, please let me know. You can private chat me, you can call me out in front of everybody. It doesn't bother me. I appreciate that. So that's that. The other piece is I will ask a lot of questions during this. Like Natalie said, you're welcome to use the chat. I'm pretty good at managing and taking care of the chat. But if I miss something, Natalie's agreed to jump in and help me out. But you're also totally welcome to unmute yourself and ask that way as well. I know it's intimidating, but it doesn't bother me. It doesn't, you interrupting me does not mess me up or challenge me in any way. Personally, I hate when I have like a really awesome question and then I have to like sit and try and remember it the whole time before there's like a good like time to get in there, and then I forget the question. So by all means, interrupt or write it down or throw it in the chat, and I'm happy to help answer any questions that people have. Did anybody have any like right off the bat initial questions, thoughts, concerns about today? Okay, super. I'm going to share my screen. I'm also going to like plow through some of this and focus on others. So if there's something that you think looks like particularly fascinating that I did not talk about, please let me know. Can everybody see my screen? Lovely. Okay, so this is a training that is normally done in like an hour and a half to 2 hours, and I'm just not going to do that. So like I said, I'm going to go through stuff, but if you see something, you let me know and I'm happy to talk about it. But before we get started, I do want to make a note of what we do. So if you are unfamiliar, MOCSA is the only rape crisis center in the Kansas City area, which means that we do serve both the Kansas side and the Missouri side of the state line. We are in Johnson and Wyandotte County over in Kansas, and then Jackson, Cass, Clay, and Platte in Missouri. And we do a lot of things because of that. These are kind of our, sometimes I talk about them as arms. I don't really know why. They're not really arms. These are just the services that we provide. First and foremost is our 24-hour crisis line. This is kind of our tether to the community. Multiple people answer it. And quite frankly, sometimes it's crisis related and sometimes it's not. Either way, if people are in true crisis and they want to call that, they can totally do that. If they need connected to resources, that's a primary use for the line. Also, if you have questions about something happened in my job, my kid said something weird, is this normal? Those are all questions that somebody can call and ask. Everybody that answers that does go through training to answer that crisis line. So if just somebody has a question related to sexual violence and if they are not able to answer it, we're all pretty good at looking up answers and then getting back to people. So if that's ever a resource that people need, by all means, I can put the crisis line information in the chat later, or you can just Google MOCSA and it's right there at the top. We do have advocacy services. Our advocates are not, they're not attorneys, they're not lawyers, but they're really good at navigating the systems that work within kind of the legal sphere of experiencing sexual violence. And so if people need ex partes, orders of protection, restraining orders, etc., they're a really good resource for that. Getting out of leases potentially, they're a really good resource for that. One of the pieces of advocacy that probably is most applicable to you all is that our 24-hour crisis line does get utilized by hospitals. So if everybody or if anybody experiences sexual violence and wants to go to the hospital to get evidence collected, to make a report, to receive medication, etc., that hospital automatically, if they provide that same exam, will call us. And we will also be there within 30 to 45 minutes. It kind of depends on where people are at, what time of day, and COVID, obviously. But we are doing that in person with COVID right now. So obviously there are things in place, masks and 6 feet and et cetera. And hospitals that call us are also aware of the things that we need. And then we're aware of the things that the hospital requests of us. But we are doing that. And so advocates, no matter what time of day, can go and bring an extra set of clothes, get them connected to resources, answer any questions, help navigate, relationships. If families or police officers or anyone is there and they need help navigating conversation, we're there to help with that. We do have counseling services, pretty basic. We counsel anyone over the age of 5, and that can kind of look like whatever that person needs it to look like, whether that's group, individual, art therapy, play therapy, sand therapy for kids. We have support groups. Those are all happening over the internet right now. So if someone is in need of counseling services, but fearful of COVID, rightfully so, by all means, we can still accommodate that. If they are unable to have access to a computer or the internet, we do also have a specific room on site that people can utilize that's disinfected every time, so that if people have the obstacle of not having the internet or not having a computer, we can still make that happen. Those are free of charge. All of our services are free of charge. Specific to counseling, those are not capped. So oftentimes if somebody's got like an EAP or insurance will only pay for X amount, that we don't collect insurance, we don't need it. And all of our services are offered at no cost. So somebody can come once a week for a year, somebody can come for 5 years. It really just depends on what people are looking for, but there is no like, you've had 6 sessions, you're done. That doesn't happen. I'm on the education team. We do a lot of education stuff like this, primarily with K through 12, definitely some adult stuff, but that looks like talking about everything that is related to sexual violence. So obviously sexual assault and consent to themselves, but also gender stereotypes, dating relationships, domestic violence, healthy relationships, boundaries. We work with people with disabilities. It kind of just depends on what people are looking for. But we do a lot of education in the community, I believe. Don't quote me on this. I know it's recorded, so sorry if anyone's watching this and then this is wildly off. I think we're on over like 30 to 32 school districts at any given time. COVID may have changed that a little bit, obviously, but at our highest, we've been in 32 school districts, which means we see tens of thousands of students a year, which is pretty cool. And then we do have an attorney and a paralegal on staff. Just like all of our other services, those services are also offered at no cost. There is a little bit extra criteria that needs to be met to get free legal services, but that is an option for people if there's ever a client that needs that. We can provide that service as well. That was really fast. And I definitely left some stuff out. That was the nutshell version. But did anybody have any questions about MOCSA services in general, what things looked like, how to get in contact with us, etc.?
Tyler, I'm curious if with COVID, with the increase of like the video capability, has that increased opportunities or decreased opportunities for people to reach out?
That's a really good question. And the answer is kind of both. It kind of depends on what people are looking for. In some ways, we can accommodate people that potentially haven't been able to be accommodated before. Maybe they're out of the service area that we have, but now they can come in. Maybe their assault happened in Kansas City, but they're from Oklahoma. They wouldn't necessarily be able to drive from Oklahoma every single time. But so in that way, we can accommodate. Also, I would say with students, especially when it's hard to unmute yourself and talk or stare at yourself on the camera the whole time. It's at first we kind of noticed a little bit less participation in that, but the flip side of that coin is they love to text. So in some weird ways, we have a lot of people that maybe aren't, and this goes for adults too, because no one wants to talk, which I totally get it. Sometimes it's easier to interrupt or type something in the chat and do it that way. It feels a little bit less intimidating. And so in some ways we've been able to have more interesting or in-depth conversations that we potentially wouldn't have been able to have if it was face-to-face, which is kind of a cool thing. I would say overwhelmingly, though, it's been more difficult, I think, for people to get services just because of access. And so we've done everything that we can to accommodate as much as we can, but nothing is as good as coming in person and doing it that way. But I think that we've been able to pivot really, really well. And so the people that we serve, our volunteers, et cetera, have also been able to pivot really, really well. And so there are silver linings to it, but for the most part, I would say that it hasn't changed our numbers by any means. It's just how we're doing it is different. Does that answer your question? Cool. Any other thoughts or questions that people may have? Okay, cool. So before I move on then with what we're talking about, I am curious. I always like to ask, like, what do we know about sexual assault already? What lens are you viewing that through? I know we're with KU Med, and so you know, when I do a lot of nursing trainings, training a lot of nursing students, and so I will always ask them to think about it through their personal lens, obviously, but also like through the lens of a medical professional, through the lens of a nurse. What does your job or your role look like? And so I will do the same here. But when I say sexual assault or sexual violence, what do people think of? What comes to mind with that? And that can be like personally or professionally. Any thoughts? Right as it got quiet, 4 sirens started outside. Sorry. What do we think of when we think of like rape, sexual assault, sexual violence? It could be examples of that. It could be myths. It could be definitions. But just like what do you think of? What pops into your head? No right or wrong answer.
I think it could be sexual abuse and it could also be mental abuse. Like I know people who've been in relationships with partners who are, they might not, hit them, but they might say mean things. And so I think I know that's not sexual assault, but to me it affects their partner, and it
100%.
affects them.
Well, yeah, there's an intersectionality there, right? Between like, oh, good to see your face.
Sorry.
Between like, no, you're fine. I don't care. I will never shame someone for hiding their camera. By all means, hide away. But yeah, you're right. Like, and different types of abuse can be utilized to break people down to make other types of abuse easier, right? And so absolutely that. Or the flip side of that is sexual abuse happens and then, well, you wanted it, or, blah, blah, blah. And then like they shame them on the back end. That's also abusive and harmful, right? A lot of times when I talk about abuse with people and I ask them to identify types of abuse, they will say like emotional abuse. So like physical, mental, emotional, etc. And I always kind of say that all abuse is emotional, right? So absolutely there are things like verbal abuse that mess with your head, but if you're being abused or if someone's being abused, that's gonna mess with your emotions. And so it's all connected for sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
What else? What do people think of when they think of like sexual assault, sexual violence?
Power and
etc.?
control.
Yeah, absolutely, power and control for sure. For sure.
Sometimes the acts of violence aren't necessarily about sexual gratification, but power and subjugation, making somebody feel powerless or disempowered because they're not as much of a threat.
Yeah, I would argue that most of the time sexual violence is not about sexual gratification as much as it's about like overpowering another person in some way. And what better way to do that than sexually, where we as a culture, we'll talk about this in a second, but like sex is something that we think about and see about and hear about all the time, but God forbid anybody say anything about it, because then it's too much, right? And so it's a really good tool to use to hurt somebody. It's powerful because of the culture that we've created. Yeah, other thoughts?
I think it can be with, a person, like date rape or, intimate partner who you know. And I know I work in the hospital and we just had somebody come in that was, locked in a basement, given meth and, sexually abused. And that kind of quite extreme cases. But
yeah, Becky, that's a good thought. Is first of all, sorry that sounds dramatic that you had to work with that. So good job. It's a range, right? It's a spectrum of like what we think of as like sexual violence, and so oftentimes we have this like script or rhetoric in our minds about like, what is this, white, right? Like white van, you know, gun to your back, neck to your throat, like these like myths, these images that we see or hear about. And do those happen? Absolutely. Do those extremes, like Becky were saying, happen? 100%. Absolutely they do. But if something doesn't look like that, does that mean that it's not sexual assault or sexual abuse? No, right? So I think sometimes we lean on the extreme. And so we have to all check ourselves about like, well, this doesn't exactly match what I think of as sexual violence, but that doesn't mean that it isn't. Does that make sense? And so I think we have to pay attention to, yeah, it could be a stranger, it could be somebody you know, it could be somebody's, you know, friend, parent, spouse, etc. It doesn't all have to be extreme. Quite often there's not huge, you know, examples of like violence. There's not like bruises, there's not like wounds. Sometimes there are, obviously, but sometimes there's not. And so does that mean that it's less traumatic than a potentially other example of that? No, it just is different, right? We have to check ourselves and make sure that something that potentially wouldn't be traumatic for us, past sexual violence, potentially is traumatic for somebody else, right? One more thought. Anybody have another thought? If not, that's totally fine. Misty, that's a hilarious joke. Okay. Well, we're going to talk about this in a minute, but when I talk about sexual assault, I think of it as an umbrella term. I assume we have all heard the term umbrella term. If we haven't, it's just a way to talk about something, but multiple things fall underneath that, right? Sexual violence is no different. So when we're talking about sexual assault, it could be talking about rape, it could be talking about intimate partner violence, dating violence, stalking, human trafficking, incest, child sexual abuse, et cetera, et cetera. And oftentimes what we see or hear in our media, specifically when we're talking about like a really high profile case, is sexual assault and rape being utilized synonymously. And that's not necessarily wrong, but I think it is important to be as clear about our language as possible, because if we're not, we could be missing people. The other thing that I think about is some people, and we'll talk about supporting survivors later in a minute, but mirroring language is really, really important. And so if someone has been sexually assaulted, we know that they've been sexually assaulted, but they are not saying that they've been sexually assaulted, or they're saying that they were raped. It behooves us to use the exact same language that they're using to describe themselves, because that's how they're processing that, right? And so it's important that we think about sexual violence as an umbrella term, because it doesn't have to just be rape. The other thing that I will say, well, I'll say that in a minute. And I'll go ahead and do it now. How we define things matter, right? So we define sexual assault as any sexual activity without consent. And then of course, rape refers to specifically intercourse without consent. I also want to make note that sometimes our culture and sometimes our laws don't always match up. And so there are some legal definitions of rape that are very based in like heteronormativity. And they do not capture a lot of people that potentially are victims of sexual assault, potentially same-sex couples or trans individuals, et cetera. So we have to make sure that we are understanding the cultural definition of rape as well as the legal definition if they don't match. Does that make sense? Okay. When I think about sexual assault, I think about rape culture. How many of you, you can raise your actual hand or your virtual hand or ignore me, it's totally fine. But how many of you have heard the term rape culture before? Okay. Some of us have. Has anyone never heard about it before? It's okay if you haven't. Okay. For those of you that have heard about it, how would you define it? What do you think that it is? Or you could give me an example of it. It's a hard question. What do we think rape culture is? It's hard, right? Because I feel like it's one of those things where we inherently understand what rape culture is. Like I know what it is, but when I'm asked to define it or put a finger on it, it's a little bit harder to do. So the way that I talk about rape culture is a culture or, romanticizing it in movies. Absolutely. Grey's Anatomy is the worst about that, right? Like fight, 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 hate you, have sex in the closet, right? And then not that that's sexual violence per se, but it definitely, there's a relationship there, right? Between like violence. And so then I think about like with younger kids, like, oh, they're pushing you down or they're picking on you because they like you. Well, that's confusing, and that can look different as an adult than it does as a cute second grader, right? And so how we're talking about it and how we're building things about consent regardless of sexual assault. So how are we treating conversations about telling students or telling kids to go give Aunt so-and-so a hug when they don't want to do that, right? That's consent. And so how are we laying the pavement there? When I think about, or when I define rape culture, I like to talk about it in a way where we live in a culture, we live in a society where rape and sexual violence is expected to happen, and then it's accepted. Okay, so we expect it and we accept it. And what that looks like is, well, they were wearing a short skirt, they were drunk, they were by themselves, they were XYZ, blah, blah, blah. They didn't carry mace in their purse and they didn't flip them over their back like they learned in their self-defense class. So what did you expect, right? If they had done all of those things, then it wouldn't have happened, but they didn't do that. So I don't know what to tell you, but like, what to expect. And then because that checks our confirmation bias, it's easy to ignore. And then we accept that as a part of life and we move on. And when we do that, we create a culture that tells people that it is your fault if you're assaulted and it is okay to assault people, right? So when we do things like victim blaming, when we do things like tell a rape joke or laugh at a rape joke or not call out a rape joke, we are telling not only that person that we're interacting with, but everyone that sees that situation that this is something that's okay. And when that happens, it snowballs, right? And so now all of a sudden we have this culture where major people, right, think of XYZ man in Hollywood, right, or in the political sphere. It doesn't matter who you're thinking about. The accountability isn't as there as it was. Now it's changing, absolutely. But that's with giant people of note, right? And so like Mr. So-and-so down the street doesn't have the same notoriety. Is he going to be called out in the same way? Depends, probably not, right? And so we have to think about rape culture as this idea that we all contribute to it by either passively letting it happen or actively contributing to it. And that's just a part of it. But what are we doing to show that rape and sexual violence is okay with us, and that we're happy with it happening? Or we're not unhappy with it enough to stop it from happening. That's rape culture. Does that make sense? So the opposite of that is we have to think about, like, we obviously don't want that to happen. It's a public health issue. So what are we doing to actively challenge or actively combat rape culture? Is that choosing not to watch something? Is that choosing not to give somebody that is a rapist money? Is that choosing to not eat at a restaurant because of, you know, they're allegedly an assault perpetrator? Whatever the case may be, it looks different for every situation and every person. But I think that that's important. So thoughts on that, thoughts on rape culture, thoughts on that in the medical world. How does that manifest itself in the hospital setting? What does that all look like?
One of the things that just popped up is the term pimping is used pretty frequently among medical students to describe the process of being sort of like quizzed in a high stress situation on things.
Interesting.
Yeah, the first time I heard that term, I was so taken aback by it. And yet that's completely normal for medical students to be described as being pimped.
Interesting. I mean, yeah, the word pimp has been in our zeitgeist for a long time, or in and out, I guess, because like, who remembers Pimp My Ride? I mean, I definitely do. There were, you know, it's a word that's used, and I think we don't think about what it actually means, but absolutely, yeah. And so when we do that, we're desensitized to what that word means, or we literally redefine what that word means, right? Yeah, absolutely. Other thoughts on rape culture?
I had a friend make a comment on Facebook. She's a nurse, and we were talking about these kinds of issues. She has very deep conversations on Facebook.
Sure.
And
Lots of people do.
Her friend made the comment about, why do people watch shows like Law and Order SVU? Because now entertainment, rape is entertainment, or sexual assault is entertainment. And I thought, I never thought of it that way before. And it has changed the way I even think about some of these shows that are on TV, or when you see commercials for them. And it's just not okay. That's not entertainment, but apparently it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's fascinating to think about. Do I think that that will go away forever? Probably not, right? Because there's money involved and there's a lot of things involved. But I think what we can do is lean into what exists and try and pressure them to change that. So an example that I think about is like, this is just a random one that I think about every June, because June is Pride Month. And so if you pay attention in Pride Month, every single Walmart, Target, Best Buy, whatever, has rainbow something or other that they sell, okay? And they don't really care about it every other month of the year, but in June, it's a thing, right? And so it would be easy to say, well, this is stupid. You're obviously just taking money from this month, et cetera, right? But there have been movements in the queer or LGBTQ community that say, no, I don't like this. A lot of Gen Zs and younger people are about this, because they're like, practice what you preach. If you're going to say that you're going to sell all this stuff, then you're going to donate at least a portion of that to an LGBT serving agency. And so we know that we're not going to be able to stop that corporate America monster, right? But we can pressure them. And so how do we lean into the Law and Order SVUs or the Grey's Anatomies or anything that talks about sexual violence in a way that makes sure that we're holding people accountable, and that if they are going to portray it, that they're portraying it in a way that is respectful and trauma informed, and actually okay, informative, right? Instead of just like romanticizing and fetishizing all of this stuff and then being like, okay, enjoy the rest of your Thursday night, right? Like, here's a lot of things for your subconscious to think about as you go to sleep, right? Like, doing something different than that. But it's really interesting, Cindy, that you said that, because it absolutely does change. It changes the way that we take information in and then think about it and process it, which is wild. Other thoughts? Okay, so think about rape culture. It comes up all the time. Try to build it into your perspective, into your lens, because I think that it's an important thing, and there will be things that you will notice that you've never thought of before that absolutely contribute to that. Okay, so I'm going to skip statistics because it's a lot, and I'm trying to keep us upbeat here. So I will say, we'll talk about consent a little bit. I'm not going to lean on this a lot, but the way that we define a consent is a freely given and enthusiastic yes. When we say that, we mean that there's no force, fear, or coercion, right? I get to make decisions based on all of the information that I'm getting, believing that that is true to me. If that is not the case, then there's no consent. Enthusiastic, obviously, you want to have sex with that person. Obviously, you want to be enthusiastic about it, but also active and ongoing, right? Just because somebody says yes on a Tuesday doesn't mean they're saying yes on a Wednesday. Just because somebody says yes to making out with you doesn't mean that they're saying yes to having sex with you. So it has to be ongoing. It has to be actively, engaged in. It is always the responsibility of the person initiating that to get that consent. And people are allowed to change their mind. People are allowed to get out of there. If your breath smells really bad, I gotta go, right? It's not for me. And so how do you create a space where everybody knows that it is okay to change someone's mind, right? Which kind of leads us into yes, which is that it has to be both clear, or it has to be clear both verbally and non-verbally. That doesn't mean like I will always get like, so I have to bring a contract in and say you can sign this to have sex with me. No, stop being dramatic. Maybe you learned that on Law and Order SVU. I don't know. But it's more like, how are we communicating that this is something that's okay with both or with all parties involved? And then do their words match their body language? So there are absolutely situations where somebody could say yes, but not mean it. What could be some of those situations? Why would somebody say yes to having sex with somebody, but not actually mean it? Any thoughts?
If they're feeling pressured, or especially within the context of a relationship, some people have this expectation that I have to say yes because it's my partner, or like they're incapacitated in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Difference in power, yeah, such as a boss, absolutely. We'll talk about that. Yeah, I think about, well, we'll talk about it now. There are situations, Julia, you're correct, thank you. There are situations where consent cannot happen. Does anybody have any ideas of what those could be? Legally, consent, it doesn't exist or it can't be there.
Children.
Yep, absolutely. So if you're under the age of consent, does anyone know the age of consent in Missouri? In Missouri?
16,
Nope,
14?
nope. That's the age that you can get married in Missouri, which is wild and gross. Becky, the age of consent in Kansas is 16.
Okay.
Yeah, Missouri, it's 17. Yeah. And so what that means, right, is that a 17 or 16-year-old gets to legally make the decision to have sex with another person. That does not mean that somebody over the age of 18 can just have sex with anybody under the age of 18 if they're the age of consent. Does that make sense? Okay. You do also have to follow the law of the state that you are in. So a 16-year-old Kansan can they come to Missouri and have sex? No, because the law is 17. When I say that in middle or high schools, eyes get big and I say, don't tell me, I don't need to know. But yeah, you do have to follow the law of the state that you're in, for sure. So age, absolutely. What else? Definitely power, like Christina said in the chat.
Or if they're sedated or drugged
Sure.
in some way.
Sure. So under the influence of something, whether that's alcohol or drugs or something like that, yeah. Does anybody know the #1 drug used to facilitate sexual assaults?
Alcohol?
Yeah, it's alcohol. I was going to say, Sarah, you probably know. That's not fair. Yeah, it's alcohol. It's not roofies. It's not weed. It's not heroin. Those absolutely happen, 100%. But it is alcohol, right? Because it's easy to get. We drink it all the time. It's built into our culture, right? So it's not suspicious at all. Natalie, did you unmute yourself? Cindy, did you have something? Oh, okay. Lack of capacity to make decisions. Absolutely. Other situations of no consent. So under the influence, under the age, power dynamics for sure.
Would language barriers be in there? I mean,
if that's being used as a way to have power over somebody else or confuse them, right? Fear.
Yeah, I think it would probably relate to that too, but that might be one.
And coercion, absolutely. Yeah. Telling people something means something else when it really doesn't, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, so we've got a list, right? Threatened, forced, or scared, blackmailed or coerced, asleep, passed out, imbalance of power or authority, age of consent, under the influence. When I think about imbalance of power, I obviously think about the hierarchical imbalances of power. So like boss, employee, teacher, student, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that there are also different ways that somebody can have power over someone else without it having to be in a hierarchy. So I think about, like, I'm a white male, there's a lot of power in that. And so I recognize my privilege in that way. And so like when I go to hospitals for people, that is the first thing that I say. Hey, this is a tricky situation. I know that statistically women tend to be victims and men tend to be perpetrators, and that I'm a white man. So I can understand that me coming into this hospital room is potentially triggering for you. Tell me if it is, and then I give them that out. And so that, I try to do things that recognize that power imbalance right away. And if they are uncomfortable, I've opened the door for them to tell me instead of them having to open the door for themselves. Does that make sense? So there are, white people have power, straight people have power, men have power, people with more money have power. People with seniority in the same position have power. If somebody's been there for 10 years versus 1 year, they may be the same level, but there's still a power imbalance there. And so social power really matters. A lot of times power looks like more than we think it looks like. And so that can absolutely contribute to somebody using their power, kind of like Sarah was saying earlier, to sexually assault someone. Thoughts, questions, concerns? I know we only have an hour and I want to get to the meat, so I'm pushing through. Okay. It is alcohol, you nailed that one. Of course, I have to say this, right? Sexual assault is never the victim's fault. We truly, truly believe that. Doesn't matter what somebody is wearing, doing, who they're with, who they are, whatever identity is there, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, rape and sexual violence is a choice that someone makes to hurt another person, okay? It's never something that is a natural consequence of you doing something at all. Okay, so I want to talk about, in fact, I'm going to stop sharing for a second because that's annoying. And I'm going to go to this. So I do want to talk about triggers. I gave a trigger warning at the beginning of this. It's kind of a buzzword, but I think triggers are really important. There are two types of triggers. There's internal triggers and external triggers. Internal triggers are things that potentially we will never see. So people are in their head, people are thinking about things, and that can trigger them. Reliving things is an internal trigger. There can also be external triggers, things that happen externally can contribute to someone reliving their traumatic experience. So a song, a smell, a date. I had somebody on the crisis line during election time that was very triggered because she was assaulted on election day. And so she was like, it doesn't matter who the president is. Oh, the election process is very triggering for me. And I was like, that really sucks because it happens all the time. And so how can we process this? What can we do? Because it's going to happen. I had somebody say that they were assaulted on their daughter's first birthday. And so every year their daughter's birthday is a trigger. And so that's going to happen. And so how do we work and process through that? So external triggers are really, really important. Which leads me to, what are some common trauma reactions or trauma situations that potentially you see in your work, and how do we address the triggers that are potentially associated with that? Does that make sense? Okay. And obviously we are being recorded, so confidentiality matters and all of that, but definitely feel free. Yeah, Natalie.
Maybe could you give an example? I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean.
Sure. So for me, when I go into a hospital with my work, part of going into a hospital is supporting people that have been assaulted. And so for me, I go into potentially a hospital room, and I obviously say, like, I recognize that I'm a white man, but I also do things like I will not wear cologne because I know smell can be really triggering. I will not wear clothes with logos on them as much as possible. And so I will never wear like my MOCSA name tag or a MOCSA shirt because I don't want to scream to the entire hospital like, this person's been assaulted. That nobody needs to know that, right? So I try to, but I can see trauma reactions happen. So people are really upset. People don't want to talk to me. People want to talk to me a lot. And so there are trauma reactions that people have. And my job is to anticipate potential triggers so that I can eliminate them and or handle their disclosure the best way possible so that I am not triggering them. Does that make sense? So can we think of, like, in the medical hospital world, what are some, and it doesn't necessarily have to be related to sexual trauma, but what are some trauma responses that we feel are pretty common? So shutting down, anger. Not wanting to talk about it, or overly talking about it, sharing way too much information. I definitely see that. Hiding eyes, so yeah, avoiding eye contact. A common one I see is like apathy. I just don't care. Natalie, what were you gonna say?
I was thinking reactions to exams, to being touched.
Absolutely. Becoming dysregulated, yeah, lashing out, yeah. For sure. So I think it's important that we understand that everyone processes trauma differently. So I know that, we're talking about trauma-informed care. The first thing is to understand that everybody processes trauma differently, and something that is traumatic for them may not be traumatic for me, but I don't get to discredit or devalue or discount their trauma because it's their reality and not mine. And so my job is to validate that, even if I don't understand it, and then get enough information so that I know that I am not re-traumatizing them in any way. Does that make sense? It's really easy to just jump to labeling people as like a difficult patient or a difficult kid, or somebody's just really grumpy or whatever. And that may be the case. They may be really grumpy, but and obviously easier said than done, but remembering that potentially, especially being in a hospital, is scary for a lot of people and traumatic, and even that is trauma. And so understanding that could be potentially contributing to their behavior makes it feel like it's less personally about you and more, something that they're processing. Like I said, easier said than done, because I'll take things personally and be like, this was not about me. You're being egocentric. It's so not a big deal. But again, that's hard to do sometimes. I want to talk about needs for survivors. So I want to talk about things that survivors need, especially when it comes to disclosures. So obviously this is a generalized list and not at all nuanced for each individual. Everyone has different traumas and processes things differently. And so everyone is different, but in general, non-judgmental conversations are really important. This says interviews because sometimes we will do this with like police officers or attorneys. If you are not one of those things, please don't interview someone. You can certainly ask questions, but don't like, hardcore interview them because that can be traumatic. A strong support system, that could be familial or friends. That could be a temporary strong support system where they trust the nurses in that space. It doesn't have to just be like this broad macro level thing. It can be a micro level experience of support. Patience, sensitivity, validation, empowerment. Those are all things that look different for everyone, but are really, really important and can contribute to making their disclosure process or them processing their trauma or their sexual violence as best as possible. Okay, so there are some do's and don'ts. I don't like to harp on the don'ts very often because oftentimes people will only remember the don'ts, which is not good. So just glance at the don't column and then ignore it, right? But definitely actively listen. And part of that actively listening is, like I said earlier, mirroring language. If they say that their boyfriend sexually assaulted them and I say the perpetrator, that may not work, right? That may be re-traumatizing to them. They may not be able to hear that. And so using the language that they use is really, really, really important. Similarly, I will sometimes have students come up to me and say, hey, I experienced blah, 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 XYZ. Is that sexual assault? And I will say, well, we just spent some time talking about sexual assault, but I'm not here to define that experience for you because you're the expert on your own experience, not me. And so if you feel like this potentially is sexual assault, we can talk about, things that we can do to get you connected to resources, but I can't tell you if it was assault or not. I wasn't there. I don't want to define that for you. But giving them the power to make decisions and define and process their own experience for themselves is really, really important. And with that comes actively listening. The other thing that comes with that is not kind of goes with don't interview, but if you are going to ask questions, make sure that we're asking questions as broadly and as open-endedly as possible. If I say, well, did they do this or did they do that? Well, maybe they didn't do either of those things, but memory and stuff, they're fragile, especially in a state of trauma. And we don't necessarily always process things, well until later on. And so if I'm planting little seeds, I could be tarnishing their testimony. And so instead of asking them open-ended questions, well, what happened next? What did they do next? What did you do next? Those are things that we can ask so that they can process it on their own. And then I'm just there to listen to that. Going with that, if this is like a medical thing that somebody needs to do, if somebody is there for, say, an exam, that's part of that exam is asking what happened. If it's not your business, if you can do your job without knowing everything that happened, don't ask them about it. Unless they need to talk to you about it, try and limit as often as possible how many times people are going to explain that, because if they choose to report, which if they are over 18, they do not have to make a report legally. That is their decision. But if they choose to do that, they're going to say their story over and over and over again. And that could be really traumatizing. So if it doesn't matter that much to you, maybe it's not your business. If you can do your job without that, maybe you don't need to know in that moment. Obviously, giving support, telling them that you believe them, those are all things that are really important. Some common missteps in the don't column are, oh my gosh, that happened to me, or something similar happened to me, and I did blah, 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 blah. Because now you've taken it away from them and it's about you. Easy to do because I want to relate to you. My intention is good, but just like sexual violence is about power and control, we need to make sure that our response to a disclosure is not about power and control. So doing things like, oh my gosh, okay, well, wow, this is really scary. I can't believe that happened to you. I'm so sorry. Thank you for telling me. You've got to call MOCSA and you've got to do this and you've got to call the cops and you've got to do this and don't take a shower and don't do this and blah, blah, blah. That's too much, right? And you're taking your power of how you would handle the situation and projecting it onto them. So instead saying things like, wow, this is really scary. Thank you for telling me that. Thanks for trusting me with that. I believe you, whatever you need to say. What do you want to do? I'm here to help. What do we want to do? I can offer to do this. I'm happy to look stuff up or look up resources on the internet for you. I'm happy to connect you to this person. Is that something that would be okay with you? But if we can put the ball in their court and let them drive the car a little bit, I'm mixing metaphors, then they get to navigate the process and navigate what is going to work best for them. Maybe they've tried XYZ, and if XYZ are the only things that we give them, well, they're like, then there are no other options, especially if I'm a medical professional and I'm the professional, and those are the options that I give. Well, if those are the options that they give, and I've already tried those, I don't even think there are any options anymore, right? So instead say, what do we want to do? And that lets them drive that bus a little bit and gives them that power back a little bit. Other thoughts. I obviously want to respect time. We have like 10 or so minutes left. That's the bulk of what I wanted to talk about. Are there, thinking through the lens of medical, are there some do's and don'ts that we see? Are there some ways that we do a really good job of handling disclosures or people of being trauma informed? Are there things that we could improve upon with being trauma informed? I'm curious to know like what you all think in terms of your expertise and your lens. How can we support people that have experienced violence in a trauma informed way through this lens? Thoughts and questions? Yeah, so highlighting the importance of maintaining choice, right? Sometimes open-ended choice isn't always there. Maybe my hands are tied because I'm a mandated reporter, or I have to do certain things because of policies in place. When there is opportunity to give option, give option. So, hey, this is a really scary situation. In this context, here are our two options. We can do this or we can do this. Which one would you like to do? I can tell you a little bit about both, and you can make an informed decision that way. But when you can give options, because that's really, really, really important. Vital, honestly, even. What else? What does being trauma informed look like for you all? Or if we don't know, are there questions about a specific situation or scenario?
I'll bring up a kind of a comment and question, Tyler. You're probably familiar with the statistics on the high prevalence of harassment in medical fields, to our medical students, to our medical staff, and and I'm curious for those providers, if they themselves have been a victim and then they are treating a victim, those moments can be triggering and trauma. And what advice would you have, or what, in those situations, how might they help themselves and the victim?
That's a really, really awesome question. I think not, I think for the sake of the victim, like I said, not being like, hey, I'm also a survivor. Because that sometimes shifts focus and can be a really knee-jerk reaction to try and find some common ground and relate. I would avoid that if possible, but I think building rapport is really, really important. So what am I doing to tell this victim or this survivor that I am a safe person? Is that saying, I recognize this, or like I said, like, like the metaphor of like opening the door for them to come to us instead of them having to do that themselves. I think about that a lot when it comes to intersectionality. A white female survivor has a very different experience than a Black female survivor or a trans survivor or whatever other intersectionalities are at place there. So first and foremost, understanding that there are some intersections that could exist, and there may be multiple conflicting identities that play a role in that. And so what am I doing to eliminate as many barriers as possible? But I think when potentially the provider is also a survivor, I think first and foremost, making sure that that person is there, like able to process it and understand that and provide those services. And if they are feeling triggered, are there processes in place whether formally or informally with coworkers, that I can get out of that situation. Hey, and it doesn't necessarily have to be like, I'm feeling really triggered right now. Hey, I actually am experiencing something right now, and I may not be the best person ethically to provide the service. Can I switch you? Can I swap you? Can I help you out? If that's possible. Because I think that's a really important piece, obviously, for the survivor and for both survivors in that situation. So what does that process look like from a meso or macro level thing? And then yes, Sarah, I was going to say grounding techniques. So if that's not an option, if I am the only person that is there to help them, it's okay to say, hey, I've got to step out for a few minutes. I'll be back in a few, and then go to the bathroom, take some deep breaths, ground yourself, have some grounding techniques that you use in your arsenal, in your repertoire. I hate that I said that. I'm trying to de-violence my language, not in your arsenal, in your tool belt. What are some things that I can do to help myself that I know work? Is that going on a walk? Is that drinking some water? Is that taking deep breaths? Is that, having a conversation with someone else, calling your support system at home, whatever that looks like. And then I think from a structural piece, like allowing people to do that. If we know that a nurse or a medical professional is experiencing some sort of trauma or re-traumatization or trigger, allowing them to take just a few minutes to compose themselves and do that. I think that's really, really important. That's a good question. Other thoughts, other questions that people have? Got like 6 or so minutes left. I can stop sharing my screen, sorry. There we go. Other thoughts or questions?
I wrote a question to myself. I am the academic advisor for our undergraduate nursing students, so I don't teach.
Okay.
But I advise. And
sure.
I am the one that they come and complain to more than anything else. And I wrote myself a note saying, do our faculty give some kind of an introduction before they do lectures on either working with sexual assault survivors or getting ready to do some kind of a clinical where they might run into patients like that. And it's not just for nursing, it's medicine and others as well. And kind of like you did at the beginning of this, you kind of presented, this is what I'm going to talk about, and could be triggering, it may not be. And then what do they do that? And then what do we do for our students who find that this is triggering, and sitting through that lecture could be just an awful repeat of what they've been through?
Mm-hmm. That's
So
a really good.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know either. I know I keep saying it, but I keep saying, like, how are we opening the door, right? If somebody is being triggered in a lecture, well, you've got a few things happening. One, they're being triggered. Okay, so they're experiencing trauma again. Two, there may be some power dynamics. I'm a student. I'm not allowed to just get up and walk away. That may be tricky. And so if someone at the beginning, if there's a lot of pressure, they may just power through and sit through that trauma. And that may not be the best thing for them. So what am I doing as a professor, or what am I doing as somebody that's advising, or what am I doing that's leading, whatever it is, to say, hey, if you need to step out, so when I go into a presentation, I will always say, I didn't say it today because I gave a little bit of one, but we're all at home. And it's not quite the same, but I will always say, this is what we're talking about. If it's triggering for, or it could potentially be triggering for you. And statistically, I know that somebody in this room has probably experienced this. And so I want to respect that. So if you need to get up and go to the bathroom, you are welcome to do that. That being said, if somebody gets up to go to the bathroom, that doesn't necessarily mean that they experience sexual violence. They could just have to pee, right? And so I'm giving people an out, one way or the other, that does not put a spotlight on people, but allows someone that is triggered to get out and somebody that has to pee to get out. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so when I can even the playing field, it feels a little bit better. And then I will always do a call to action at the end. If you were triggered and you need to talk to me about it, you are absolutely welcome to pull me aside, or you can email me, or you can call me, and we can have a conversation about that. If you're a student and that's inappropriate, who are some safe people that you can talk to address that? And so that way I am not just being like, here's a bunch of information about sexual violence, figure it out, and then leaving, right? Because that doesn't feel good. So giving people that out and then giving people an opportunity to come back and process it if they need to. Does that make sense? And I don't know what that looks like, Cindy. That may be built into the process. It may not be, but it definitely would be helpful for sure. Good thought. With the 2 minutes that we have, any other thoughts? We could keep talking forever if we really needed to. We haven't even talked about the patriarchy. That could be a whole 2 hours. We're not going to do that today. Yeah, while we're ending, I'm going to give a link to a SurveyMonkey link. Everybody loves a SurveyMonkey link. It's very short, 2-3 minutes. Please fill that out if you can. Oh, I just sent it directly to Sherry. Sorry. Here, let me send it to everybody. Here you go. My name is Tyler. You don't have to put my last name, but that is my last name. I will also leave my email. You are welcome to email me if you have questions that you did not feel like asking in front of the group. That is totally fine. I'm happy to answer those. You can call me as well, but I'm in the office sometimes and not in the office and working from home sometimes, so email is probably the best. But you can also always call that crisis line. If something happens and you're not sure how to handle it with a patient or a client or a student, what do I do in this situation? Did I say the wrong or right thing? Whatever that question is, you are welcome to call that crisis line. Everyone that answers that will be able to help you or will be able to connect you to help you. And if they don't know, then you say, can I talk to Tyler? And they will get it to me. So that's totally fine. But otherwise, I genuinely and greatly appreciate you, specifically this group of people, taking the time to talk about this, because oftentimes when someone is in the hospital and discloses sexual violence, it's the first time that they've done so. And so the way that you all handle it really, really matters. And the fact that you are willing to have a conversation and take your lunch hour to have this conversation with me means that you actually care. And that's huge. That goes a really, 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 really long way for a lot of people. So kudos to you. You're already doing great things. If you ever have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. But otherwise, that's all that I have. Any final thoughts? Super. Great.
Thank you so much, Tyler. We really appreciate
thank you
your time.
all. I really, really appreciate it. And hopefully, like I said, if you need to reach out, you totally can.
And Tyler will have an encore presentation next week at our panel discussion on Thursday.
Yeah.
So stay tuned for more.
Cool.
Thank you all.
Yep. See ya. Bye.